When working with Spring, we're able to use the value annotation to inject properties from our external configuration files. So for example, here we are using the value annotation on a method argument, and we could also use this on one of our fields within a particular class. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at another approach that allows us to inject properties from our external configuration files. So instead of specifying the value annotation on our field, we're going to use a different annotation provided by Spring Boot, and that's the configuration properties annotation. This annotation allows us to specify a prefix, and this prefix is actually going to come from your application.properties file. When we look at the property my.messageValue, my is considered the prefix and messageValue would be considered the final node of the property. So if we head back to our class, you can see that we specify a prefix of my, and then if we're to look at our fields and we take our field name and we would concatenate that using dot notation with our prefix, we would provide the coordinates of our field within the myMessage class, or our path to that field. Using this approach, Spring Boot is able to inject properties into our beans and configuration classes. So I'll go ahead and clean up our imports, and then we need to register this class with our application so that it is qualified to have its properties injected. And the way we do that is by adding an enable configuration properties annotation to our application class. And within this class, we need to specify all of the classes that are available to have properties injected within them. And we would like that to occur on our myMessage class. So I will go ahead and specify the class, registering it to have properties injected. And then the final thing that we need to do is we need to head to the application configuration class, and we need to just comment out these annotations so we don't step on our toes when we run this application. We don't want to have these beans registered. We can also change our message value to something a little bit more distinct. So let's just say 13, and we'll spell it out to be very specific. So now if we run our application, what we'll see is that once we navigate to the browser, we are then able to confirm that our properties were injected from the external configuration files. And that's all due to the way that Spring Boot is able to bind our properties to different fields within our beans. This approach is very flexible. It allows you to use several variations of the property name. So for example, you can write your property names in all caps, separated by underscores, much like you would using a database. It also allows you to use dashes in that manner. And you can see actually IntelliSense is helping us out there and showing us the valid values. We're just going to go with the all caps approach for our next demonstration. Before we run that demonstration, I'd like to show you another way that we can register our bean to have its properties injected. So we don't necessarily need to specify the enable configuration properties annotation. Instead, we can just rely upon component scanning to pick up our myMessage bean, but we need to make sure we annotate it as such. So we'll add the component annotation. This will make the class get picked up during component scanning. It will become a bean. Spring Boot will notice the configuration properties annotation and then inject the appropriate properties from our configuration file. So let's rerun our application and we'll just take a look. We'll get the same result, but we can just validate that our changes are now working. So we'll head back over and let me just do this to prove I'm actually applying the changes. So there we go. We see that we were able to use the more flexible approach to configure our property injection. And for our final demonstration, we're going to specify the specific source of our properties. So we're going to create a new properties file. So I'm just going to copy, so Control Z, Control V, our application.properties file. And I'm going to name this file example.properties. And if we open that file, let's make this 15 now. And what we can do is within our myMessage class, under the configuration properties annotation, we are actually able to point to a specific file. So here we can say that we would like to use the example.properties file on our class path. Now, when we provide a specific location for the configuration properties annotation, it will override any of the defaults that Spring Boot's going to put in place. So it's going to ignore the application.properties file. Now, when you run this demonstration, be sure to shut down the Spring Boot application and then rerun it. So now if we navigate to our browser, we can hit our REST controller and we see that we receive the new value which has been injected from the example.properties file. And we were able to specify that by providing the locations element on the configuration properties annotation. So you can see how Spring Boot really assists us by injecting the properties we have configured directly into our beans with minimal explicit configuration on our part. Now, I would argue that it's not as self-documenting as actually having those configurations specified right within the class file, but really that is your preference as a developer. The ability to inject these properties is one of the many features within Spring and Spring Boot that allows us to run the same source code within multiple environments. We see this within profiles as well. So in this lesson, we took a look at another tool that Spring Boot provides to us to allow us to manage kind of the build process in working in multiple environments.